Well, it's lovely to be here to talk about failure. Failure is everywhere. It's in the infrastructure of the building, as you can see. It's all around us. And I think for people, it's a little like imposter syndrome. Everyone has it, and the only people that don't have it are those who are lying about it. I've got imposter syndrome, I bet you've got imposter syndrome. And I've failed at things, and I bet you've failed at things. And guess what? I bet you're going to carry on failing at things. So the question for me is not really does failure or not getting things right exist, but how do you deal with it? So I'm going to tell you 3 stories about myself, then a little bit of summing up and then hand over. So story 1 is about me as a fresh medical graduate out of medical school, very excited. I was passionate about the brain because somebody called Roger Carpenter had really enthused me as a student. But I was quite confused as a trainee doctor. There was all this medical stuff and not much about the brain. It was all terribly exciting. And I got really carried away with the hospital I was at and the people I was around me who said, you must press on, you must become a consultant as quickly as possible, you must apply for this job. And in a fit of excitement that I can barely recall now, many years later, I decided that I was going to be a renal physician. Now, those of you who know me know that kidneys are not my favourite interest, although fried with a bit of cream and red wine, they're really quite nice. But for some reason, I had decided that was the way to become a consultant the quickest. And so it was a deep mystery to me why, as a young man in a considerable hurry, with a fantastic CV and all of my accoutrements well displayed at interview, that they rang me up and said I hadn't got the job. And I was really upset. And it all turned out fine, because of course I was really upset. And I was really upset at my failure to get a job which I thought was critical for my professional advancement at a very early stage of my career when I was in a hurry. Why it turned out okay was I was forced to think about what job I really wanted, rather than the job that was just on offer in front of me that everyone said was the one to advance you. And on thinking about that, I thought probably I should have a think about this neuroscience that I was really interested in as an undergraduate and had sort of lost touch with. And so I applied for a job at Queen Square as a senior house officer. I got that job, and as soon as I walked through the door, I realised what a mistake it was thinking I was going to be a renal physician. So what did I learn from that story? I think I learnt that I wasn't very self-aware when I was applying for those jobs. I hadn't really sat down and thought to myself, honestly, what do I really want to do? Not in a kind of deep, meaningful, what am I going to do with my life kind of way, but just in a very simple, do I really want to apply for this job, or is this completely mad? And then what I learnt was, after my failure, having a bit of self-awareness where I actually sat down and thought, again, not deeply, not some vast, great philosophical conversation, just a kind of, well, what am I interested in doing and what jobs are available? That simpler and more self-aware approach stood me in good stead and in fact set me on the path to where I am today. So the second story I want to tell you is a kind of me further along. Right now I'm a principal investigator at UCL and doing a great job and thinking, this neuroscience thing is great and I really want to do public engagement and knowledge transfer. And gosh, they've asked me to do a lunch hour lecture in Brain Awareness Week. And for earlier mid-career me, that was like, woo, that's amazing, that's so cool, that's great. I was so excited. But also by that time, I'd had some young children with my wife, obviously, and they were doing what all young children do, going to primary school. And what primary schools do, I don't know if you haven't got children or if you that's not a problem, but let me tell you what primary schools do. They try to get your children to do things like play in a concert. And usually it's in the middle of the day, and usually they give you, as much as 2 or 3 days notice. And so, sure as eggs are eggs, that's what happened. Brain Awareness Week was coming up. My lecture on the brain and consciousness was all scheduled. 25,000 flyers had gone out. The lecture theatre was booked. And the school announced my daughter was going to play in her first ever flute concert and could her dad please come along at lunchtime, you bet, on the same day. And so I completely failed in terms of scheduling. That is an epic fail. And I had a really tough decision to make. Let people down or let my daughter down, who at the time was 6, 7, so they don't really understand about that sort of stuff. Now, of course, what I chose to do, which I found very traumatic and very upsetting, was to go to my daughter's concert, which of course was wonderful and great, but I had to let my colleagues down. However, what happened next was a wonderful individual who I shan't name, but she was until recently a member of staff here, has moved away recently, stepped in, even though I didn't know she was going to step in. She's a much better communicator than I am, has gone on to a much more distinguished career, both in science and science communication, and gave a wonderful lecture. And so I guess what I learned from that story is, although failure can happen through your own, missteps or misscheduling, we aren't alone. We live in a community. This is an academic community. And there are some amazing colleagues around you who will step in and spot you and support you and help you. Not all the time and not every time, but often the consequences of you failing at something are not as bad as you think, because you have wonderful colleagues and you can then pay that forwards. And then the third and final story I'm going to tell you is, again, a little further on in my career a few years ago. So now I'm privileged enough to be Dean of Life Sciences. I never thought I'd say Dean of Life Sciences, because I never thought I'd be part of the Faculty of Life Sciences, because I lived in brain sciences. And at the time, I was leading a successful department, which many of you will know, and I was having a great time. And so what I thought was, do you know what? I'm really enjoying this. I've got my self-awareness sorted, I've got wonderful colleagues around me. I wonder what happens, how do I get to become a dean? And I thought, with all that self-awareness, that what I needed was another job in a slightly bigger department. And I applied for that job and was interviewed for that job and was rejected again for that job. And that really upset me. I thought, why? Obviously, why was because there was a better candidate, and they're still doing that job, and they're doing a better job, I'm sure, than I am. But I was very, very upset, because I thought that, again, I got it all wrong, just like at the beginning of my career. That what I was anticipating as my future was not the future that my colleagues had planned for me, and was not what I was suited to. But again, what I didn't realise was that isn't really how the world works. Again, there were colleagues around me, and so my dean then found another role for me that used some of my talents and allowed me to think and develop in a way that I wouldn't have done if I'd got that job. And that in turn led to me applying for and being interviewed for and ultimately getting the role that I currently love and I'm really fulfilled in doing. So I think that story again tells me that when things go wrong like that, when one door closes, often another one that you didn't even know existed opens, because people are out there in that community looking for all the talent we have out there and trying to make the most of it. And I think those are my sort of three stories that I'm going to tell you, from which I hope you can get some insight into things that might go wrong in your life. Now, in closing, how did I cope with that? What was my resilience? Lots and lots of things to say to that, but I think I want to highlight two. One is, it's important to be upset and or angry and or pissed off. Excuse my French if we're videoing that. That's because these things are upsetting. This isn't really about sort of saying, oh yeah, failure, I'm so rational, I'm such a great human that I can rationalise everything. I think it's really important to acknowledge and to experience the fact that it really is quite upsetting when you really want something, a grant, a paper, a job, or whatever, and you don't get it. And so I certainly allow myself all of that upset and anger sometimes as well. But I think you've got to be careful where you show it. I take that home and allow myself 24 to 48 hours and that sort of thing. Your mileage may vary, but I wouldn't recommend, for example, sending out angry emails or shouting at people at work or any other sort of unprofessional behaviour. That is, the emotion is yours, feel it with your colleagues, with your friends, but don't necessarily engage in letting it out, and give yourself a little bit of time to feel it before moving on. And then I think the flip side of resilience for me is everyone will have an individual strategy. I guess we're going to learn a bit about that later. So for example, I was saying to colleagues beforehand, for me, as an individual who has always abhorred all forms of sport, both as an observer and a participant, in the middle of my life I have found that running is something that really makes a big difference to me in terms of my resilience. It's actually the ability for me to leave wonderful colleagues like you, leave wonderful people like my family, leave wonderful situations like sitting at home with a glass of red wine, and go out in the cold and the rain and the wet and have a little bit of time that's on my own. Albeit not particularly comfortable time, although sportswear is amazingly good at keeping you warm and dry in the worst of weather. But that for me is really important. Your mileage may vary, but there'll be things you have and tricks you have for resilience for you. And the other bit of resilience for me is the retrospectoscope. This is a device my PhD advisor told me about, which exists only in people's imagination. But the retrospectoscope, you view your life through it, but backwards, of course, you're looking back. And you're constructing a story of your progression, your academic, progression. I don't think this is about the personal aspects of your life, it's about the professional aspects, but it could incorporate those. And that retrospectoscope can be used to produce those intimidating career talks where people like me or your colleagues stand up and give you a list of all the academic posts they've achieved in remarkable time and the huge amounts of grant income they've produced and the incredible quality papers that they've delivered and the vast insights, and everyone else is left feeling, again, that their imposter syndrome is great. I've both given and received talks like that. But I think that retrospectoscope is a constructed narrative, and just as you construct the narrative based around your successes, I think you can also construct a narrative based around the things that don't go quite so right, because it's all you, and you've got to keep your life going, your professional life going, to the point where you want to retire or stop or do something else. And so that retrospectoscope for me is a powerful way of weaving some of the things that I feel less comfortable about into a story that I can understand, that makes sense to me, and hopefully makes sense to you. And then the final story, and I'm going to wind up now, it's not really a story. It's to say there's an unwritten story here. So I've told you about sort of acts of commission, things I have attempted to do that I most definitely did not get or did not succeed at. But I also worry increasingly as I get older about the sort of acts of omission, the failures that didn't happen because I didn't actually apply or didn't actually write that grant or didn't actually take that chance. And so I'd also think in your own heads about whether you've got the balance of risk right, because of course the easiest way not to fail is not to try in the first place. It's a bit like risk, you minimize risk by not doing anything, but then you perhaps also minimize your enjoyment of your life because you never take any risks. On the other hand, extreme amounts of risks are perhaps not advisable as well. So I also worry as I've got older about failures of omission where I haven't done that. And I think then in wrapping up, that also sums up the sort of challenge. Failure and success are everywhere and all around us. I've told you about some big ones, but I'm sure there's a little one here. I'm sure all of us are going to fail in some way this evening, tomorrow morning, and I'm sure all of us are going to succeed tomorrow morning in some small way. So life is this constant interplay and change. So the quote I will leave you with is one which is attributed to Winston Churchill. And I always thought it was Winston Churchill, but I looked it up last night, and it turns out it's much more disappointing than that. It comes from a Budweiser advert in the 1930s. It's all contested, but everyone thinks it's from Winston Churchill, but it's in fact from an American beer advert. But it's quite, I think it's quite nice. Yeah, there you go. Etymology of quotes, it's all terribly interesting. It's the one that says success is never final, failure is never fatal, and it's the courage to continue that counts. And I think that encapsulates me that this is all contingent, right? You might feel that everything is going really well right now. I hope it is for you. But of course, that success is never final. But even if you have a failure, that is never fatal, well, apart from the fatal ones where you get run over by a bus, but that's a different story. And really, it's about how you engage with that dynamic and how you have the courage to live your life professionally, personally, or in other ways, in a way that makes you fulfilled and makes you have the career that you would like. Thank you.